Right now, there's a lot of money frozen from Syria and Iran in the United States through the sanctions.
That's right.
And that's money we can go after. Who knows what's going to happen in the Trump presidency?
Right.
And we don't know how Syria is going to shake out at all.
Welcome, everyone, to the Quad Interviews. And today I have the privilege of interviewing a very special guest, all the way from New York, but she also spends time in Vienna, where she has an office, and now in Israel, Deborah Sturman, who is an incredible lawyer who has sued successfully German industry for slave labor during the Second World War. She has sued the Swiss banks. And now, Deborah, you are suing some very nasty characters, which are the terrorist organizations that have killed innocent Israelis, as well as the countries that fund and enable them. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you.
Deborah, what a career, what a life. I want to just briefly go over some of your very resounding successes, especially when you sued and won German industry, many of the big companies, for using Jewish slave labor during the Second World War, during the Shoah. Tell us a little bit about that.
The 1907 Hague Land War Convention provides that prisoners of war are not allowed to work against the war effort in their own country, against their own country. And if they do work as such, they have to be paid individually after the war. And they were never paid.
How many people are we talking about here?
Well, we were incentivized, shall we say, against our wishes to include the Slavic war prisoners that were working as well. So there was two categories of compensation. For the Jewish ones, which were paid much, much more, because there the industry departed from the traditional economics of slavery, which was that you work a slave and then they have children and you work their children and you continue to have slaves. But the German war industry meant to work them to death.
They worked them and then they either killed them or they just worked them to the bone until they died.
Both.
Wow.
If they started to get weak and couldn't work, they had very little food.
Deborah, which companies are we talking about here?
Every company in Germany that had more than 11 employees used slave labor.
Unbelievable.
Everyone. Boss, Siemens, Volkswagen, Daimler, Bayer, everything.
And how many people did you bring this class action for?
Well, you don't have to name how many people you're bringing it for. It ended up to be about 30,000 claimants.
Wow.
When you bring a class action, you are representing a group of people who are similarly situated.
Right.
And then you have a lead plaintiff or a class representative who is representative of them, but the individual details of his or her suffering isn't really the point. The point is to establish liability as a whole.
So you win this case and then you move on to the Swiss banks?
They were at the same time.
Okay.
They were done at the same time.
And what happened there?
The Swiss banks was actually a settlement. The German slave labor one ended up to be resolved through a treaty.
Interesting.
The government stepped in and sort of stopped us in our tracks. It was not the result we wanted.
Really? But it would have been really embarrassing for them if you would have won the case in court, I'm assuming.
Right. But the motions to dismiss were granted. That means that we would have to appeal the motions to dismiss.
Right.
We thought we were right, and I'm pretty sure we would have won in the appeal. But the Swiss banks case was done by an absolutely brilliant judge who was clever enough not to make any decisions because then they couldn't be appealed. So he forced a settlement. That was, Paul Volcker, we used Paul Volcker, who the former Secretary of the Treasury, to do the largest audit in history. And he audited the Swiss banks for accounts that hadn't moved since May 8th, 1945.
What sums were we talking about here?
It would have been about $7.5 to $8 billion, but we settled, because we had to settle, for $1.5 billion. But now we've seen in the last couple of weeks that Credit Suisse had not revealed everything to Paul Volcker.
And so what, you're going back to that?
You can't. The settlement's a settlement, it's over. And it was certified as a class, which means that no one else can sue. Now, the German settlement was different. The German settlement was, we filed individual cases against each of the companies with a class representative, someone who actually worked at the company, Volkswagen, Siemens, Hugo Boss, all of them. And Ford Motor Company, by the way, also. And we sued each one of them with someone who worked. And then what happened was the German government stepped in and the United States government stepped in. And there were negotiations between the State Departments of both, with us, and with representatives of German industry, and with representatives from 8 countries: Israel, Russia, Belarus, Poland, Czech Republic. So those were negotiations went on for 3 or 4 years. And then we reached a settlement, but we were still negotiating when Bill Clinton and Gerhard Schröder signed a treaty behind our backs.
Wow.
So it wasn't a legal settlement in that respect.
But without your case, they would never
No,
gotten to
never.
that point. So it's
Never.
used as, I guess, political pressure as well as a,
Right. Well, more than political pressure. Part of what they agreed was that if anyone brought a case against German industry for slave labor or anything else except for art, the State Department, the United States State Department, would submit a brief to the court saying that it's against America's political interests to allow that case to go forward.
Wow. So they boxed you in, but they gave you the compensation you were looking for.
Well, less than. We were ready to go a bit higher. You know, when you're negotiating settlements, you know when they're ready to go higher.
Right.
They were ready to go higher.
And then the treaty kind of stopped you in your tracks.
Without even telling us beforehand.
Wow. Well, I guess that's the nature of the game. So, Deborah, at what point did you then shift after an incredible legal career? I'll mention that you're also a musician by training, and that's how you started out your career. But we move now to the second Intifada, the horrors. This is actually the type that I made Aliyah with my husband in 2001. I remember many of those terror attacks because they happened right here in Jerusalem. Is your first case that you started suing for the number 18 bus, I think it was in 2003?
Well, the firm that I work with represented a large number of the people who are on the airplanes on September 11th.
Oh, right. So that's what the specialty comes from.
That's when this group developed in the firm to take care of terrorists.
The firm is Motley Rice.
Yes, and I have my own firm that's very closely associated with Motley Rice. It's for other reasons.
So you're associated with Motley Rice and you've got your own firm. And Motley Rice sued who exactly for 9/11?
The airlines.
Why?
Well, they were negligent. Before 9/11, it was the airlines who were responsible for ground security. And there's interesting stories about that. For example, the planes that took off were all mostly from Boston, and United Airlines was the one who was responsible for ground security that time.
Yeah.
The woman who was in charge of ground security that day was married to Mohammed Atta's former roommate.
Oh my God.
From Hamburg, when he was living in Hamburg. And as far as I understand, he disappeared. And the airlines were just negligent. Of the 20 terrorists, they stopped one from getting on the plane, but the others were on a watch list.
They were on a watch list and they got on the planes.
Right.
Anyway.
It wasn't a prohibition list, it was just a watch list. But nonetheless, there was many red flags missed, that they got on with these these wallpaper cutters and these razors effectively, and the airlines were negligent.
I didn't understand that, actually. I mean, it was ridiculous that so many of them were successful, but I didn't understand how negligent they were. I guess all of us just know how security protocol changed from 9/11 onwards, that we all have to take our shoes off and we can't have any bottles. And sometimes it feels ridiculous. And in Israel, we get so criticized for doing more profiling of the person. But in fact, if they would have done what Israel does, 9/11 wouldn't have happened.
Absolutely.
And what happened with that? Were you successful?
Yes, we got some of the highest settlements for the individuals on the plane. There was also another government interference again. You get these big political cases, the government interferes. So the government made a 9/11 fund and put Kenny Feinberg, who's a skilled and very renowned settlement distributor, to distribute the money that the government put in the fund. We weren't happy with some of the things he did, and we continued to sue anyway, and to get more money from the airlines for some of these people. One of the things he did that I found particularly unnecessary was to discount life insurance. So if somebody had life insurance, he discounted whatever they received from the life insurance from the fund
In
payment.
other words, washing their hands off the whole thing.
But that's not fair.
Of course not.
somebody paid for life insurance.
Of course.
So there was that. There was other unfairnesses and other, you always have to compromise. A settlement's always a compromise.
Of course it is.
But that was, so the governments get involved very often in the cases that we do.
Well, that means obviously you're barking up the right tree. That's what's happening.
You would think. Yes, we have attorneys generals when we do cases in the United States, we have attorney generals filing amicus briefs against us or for us.
Wow.
It depends.
So, okay, so you were successful at 9/11.
But we're not finished with those because some of the families didn't want to settle until certain information is released.
So they don't want money, they just want justice.
They want both, but I mean, sometimes justice, all you can do is get money. And for the Holocaust survivors, it was a meaningful amount of money.
Yes, it was. So when do you become the person who is suing for the victims of the Second Intifada? At what point do they come to you and you say, this is a case I'm going to take on?
I love those cases. I would never, when you go to law school and between your second and third year of law school, all the law firms come to the school and try to recruit you. And I would look up the firms and they would be defending the opioid people or tobacco. And I'm not going to do that. I would never do that. And I was going to be on the plaintiff side all along, which is riskier and you fund your own cases.
Yeah.
And it's something that I couldn't see myself doing that.
You couldn't see yourself defending the bad guys
people,
or
right.
the big
And
companies.
that was an interesting thing that happened in the Swiss banks and Holocaust cases was there was a very famous law firm representing the Swiss banks. And a lot of the young associates, they had associates from Harvard, Yale, the top law schools. And the young associates said, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I don't want to do that. And they said, well, all right, we've already taken this mandate on and we'll continue this one, but we won't do any more. And then they took on German industry, representing German industry. And the arguments they used, the German industry used in their defense, were very much the same arguments used in the Nuremberg trials. That they were following orders and it wasn't that.
Yeah.
And 30 young associates walked out.
Really?
Yeah, I was proud of this.
So there are people who really need some type of meaning and integrity in what they do.
I wouldn't do the other cases. I talked to my friends I went to law school with, and they're proud of their successes and great cases, but they were on the wrong side.
It's interesting. But you're always on the right side, Deborah. So tell us a little bit about the victims of the Second Intifada and what you're doing for them.
Well, the case against Arab Bank has gone a good deal. I'm not involved in the day-to-day of that one. At the beginning, I was more involved, and now I'm involved whether it was settlement things. We filed against a number of people, including Arab Bank, which is a bank that was providing payments to the so-called martyrs.
Okay.
And
from who? Who was putting the money in the bank?
Donors.
So donors were putting money in the Arab Bank, and the Arab Bank were funding the pay to slay, essentially. They were funding the martyrs or the families of the people who committed
the crimes,
the suicide bombers, essentially.
Right, and that's illegal in the United States. You're not allowed to aid and abet terrorists.
So this was mainly it's only for the American victims, or for any victim?
For the American victims.
For the American victims. So American victims of the Second Intifada can go through you, sue the Arab Bank that were basically gathering the money to pay the martyrs.
Right. You have to have a nexus to the United States to sue in the United States. Jurisdiction is a big issue. Now, there's something called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which gives foreign sovereigns a great deal of immunity, which Syria and Iran are, of course, foreign sovereigns. It gives them a great deal of immunity. But there are exceptions, including acts of terrorism or supporting terrorism.
So do you have to prove that they're supporting terrorism, the countries?
Yeah.
And then they're liable for compensation. What happens if they don't pay up?
Well, right now, there's a lot of money frozen from Syria and Iran in the United States through the sanctions.
That's right.
And that's money we can go after.
It is.
Yeah.
And they can unfreeze it for this specific purpose.
If we have a judgment, why not?
So where is this case now?
In the federal court in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C.
Are they going to do some type of political deal, do you think, or pass a bill in order for this not to proceed?
Possibly with Syria, depending on how things shake out there. We don't know. And Iran, We don't know either. Unlikely at the moment, because we don't know what's happening in Iran if it continues like this. Who knows what's going to happen in a Trump presidency.
Right.
And we don't know how Syria is going to shake out at all. So possibly. There's a process in the United States. So it's not just the money, it's information too. And that's one of the reasons that the 9/11 cases aren't finished, because people want more information. So what happens in the United States, as opposed to other countries, is you file a lawsuit, and then the first decision that's made is whether the case is in the appropriate court and can be brought there, whether the law allows that case to be brought there, and then if it's plausible. Now, we don't have any problem with those two issues, I don't think, here, right? This is a clear violation of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. Okay. So is a clear exception to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, and there's enough evidence in the public realm that defines what they've done and why it's plausible that this is the case. So the next step would be discovery then. Once the motion to dismiss that they're likely to file is denied, then we can ask for documents and information. Now, we're not likely to get a lot of it from them, but we could get it from the State Department. We could get it from other sources, or banks that are working with U.S. dollars. To work with U.S. dollars, you have to deal with the American government.
That's interesting. And okay, so this is still in process, the case against...
We've just now filed the first case with about a couple hundred individuals, and we've got another couple hundred we'll file later once we get everyone's information in a row. And that's been filed. It's going to take 6 months to a year for the motion to dismiss to get through, because even more now, because you have to formally serve the complaint on the defendants.
Right.
And there's no representation in the United States except in the UN, and you have to actually formally serve it. There's something called the Hague Convention that allows you to serve it to these places, and it's complicated, but it'll get done.
So, Deborah, how much of the machinations that we see in terms of politics and foreign relations, how much of that involves what you're doing? In other words, when the United States is getting involved in working with other countries, is this a consideration for them, or does this continue until they're put under pressure?
It depends how important it is for them. Germany was really upset, not least because we took out full-page ads in the New York Times when where physical newspapers were still a thing. Really bad. We had one that had the Daimler star and it said design, performance, slave labor. They didn't like it. They were quite upset. So that pressured them. They actually raised the amount of settlement after 4 days of those ads by a great deal. So yes, there's a lot of, it depends. It depends on much political pressure. I don't think Iran cares so much.
They don't.
No.
And Syria is in a mess right now.
Right, but we don't know what Syria's going to shake out.
True.
Unlikely that it's going to be a country that cares much. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But it depends on a great deal of things. But it is a thorn in their side, and it gives the people who are victims an avenue to state their sentence, their feelings and their needs publicly, and also to demand information that we have an access point that other people don't.
It's incredible, and it makes me think now, you hear in Israel that a deal was made with Hamas through Qatar in order to get back our hostages, which everybody wants to see our hostages home. But as a result of that deal, we see convicted murderers walking the streets. Right. And my question to you when we first met is there any recourse, at least for the American victims of some of these terrorists who are being released? Do they have a recourse now through the work that you do in civil courts in America?
Civilly, it's not. In theory, yes, but practically, no. You've got these people who don't have a lot of money. So even if you were to sue them...
But you can sue their sponsors?
Well, they're already being sued.
So their sponsors are already been sued, but not particularly for this, for the ones that have been released in the last few days?
They can be. I mean, if they were involved in the Intifada too, yeah.
They can just add on to their...
We could add on, but the point is it costs money. We do this on a contingency basis. So we put up all the money for the entire case, and we don't get paid unless we're successful.
That's great.
So we've been doing this case, 9/11 case, for 20 odd years, and we've settled some cases, but some of them they're not. So we haven't been paid a penny for 20 years in these things. The tobacco litigation that Motley Rice did I think it was the largest settlement in history, $267 billion. It took them 25 years.
Incredible.
But it was successful.
But at least, I've got a friend who is a victim, survivor of the second Intifada, of one of the cases you're involved in. And to her, at least, my friend Sari Singh, it's so important, the work that you do. It does, whether it's in the end a financial compensation or not, but like you said, and I think that's why your work is so meaningful, it's really about justice. And justice sometimes can come in the form of compensation, and sometimes it adds other forms of justice. But at least we know, Deborah, with people like you who've been fighting this good fight, that there is justice, whether it comes now or it comes in 20 years. There is justice for many of those victims, or at least partial justice for many of those victims.
It also encourages the criminal courts to get active sometimes as well. I represent a number of the people who were on the Ethiopian airplane crash. And that was a criminal case that was brought in the Department of Justice against Boeing, who was responsible. And I'm not sure how much publicity and effort that criminal case would have had if the victims weren't screaming their heads off from the rooftops through our cases.
Well, I think that's the point. Once you move the needle in one way, things start to rearrange themselves, or at least you make enough noise that it becomes an issue for people.
Right.
And that's part of it.
Yeah. During the Holocaust cases, we got me and a guy called Nat Chapo, who was the insurance commissioner of Illinois. In the United States, insurance is regulated by the states, not federally. So he was in charge of the insurance commission of Illinois. And we got 4 states to pass a law that said that the German insurance companies couldn't work in those states until they straightened their act up with us.
So it's like BDSing the perpetrators.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for all the incredible work that you do, Deborah. We hope to see many successes. We're very happy that you're coming to Israel regularly and helping many people. And God bless you for all the wonderful work that you've done.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed doing it.